Beneath the baked plains of southern Mesopotamia, under layers of wind-blown dust, broken pottery, salt-stained earth, and the later fame of Sumer, there is an older beginning that history almost forgot. It does not announce itself with royal inscriptions. It does not speak through named kings, carved victories, or dramatic chronicles of conquest. It waits in quieter forms, a painted bowl lifted from the ground in fragments, the ghost of a mud brick wall, a temple rebuilt again and again on the same sacred mound, the faint outline of canals where water once moved through a landscape that no longer looks the same, before the great cities of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash became symbols of the world's first civilization. Another world was already gathering itself in the heat and marshlight of the ancient south. It was older than Sumer, less famous than Egypt, and more difficult to see because it left no written voice behind. Yet without it, the story of civilization begins too late. In the usual memory of the ancient world, Sumer stands near the beginning like a bright marker in the dark. It has writing, cities, temples, bureaucrats, myths, astronomical observations, law codes in the wider Mesopotamian tradition, and names that can still be spoken thousands of years later. Sumer gives history something solid to hold. Its clay tablets preserve transactions, hymns, arguments, offerings, lists, and stories. Its cities rise from the alluvial plain with a confidence that seems to announce a sudden leap from village life to urban civilization. But archaeology has a habit of making sudden leaps look slower when the ground is examined carefully. Under the levels associated with Sumer and the early cities of the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, there are older layers, older habits, older forms of organization. What survives in the record suggests that the roots of Sumerian civilization reached down into a culture that had already spent many centuries learning how people might live together in larger, more organized, more symbolically unified communities. That culture is usually called the Ubaid, named after Tel al-Ubaid, a site near Ur where distinctive pottery and remains help define it for modern archaeology. The name is modern and convenient, not something the people called themselves. That fact matters. The Ubaid people did not leave a label for their world. They did not write down a founding story, a king list, a map of their territory, or a prayer explaining who they believed watched over their fields and waters. Their civilization, if the word is used carefully, has to be reconstructed from traces. It must be approached like a shoreline at low tide, where shapes appear slowly and never completely. Scholars still debate how centralized Ubaid society really was, whether it should be called a civilization in the same sense as later Sumer, and how much continuity there was between these older communities and the urban world that followed. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is not empty. It points toward a long experiment in settlement, ritual, exchange, irrigation, craft, and shared identity long before the names of Sumerian kings were impressed into clay. The landscape itself is the first part of the mystery. Southern Mesopotamia is not a place that offers civilization easily. It is made by rivers, but those rivers are restless. The Tigris and Euphrates bring water from distant mountains, then spread across a flat alluvial plain where channels shift, flood, dry, split, and vanish. The land can be fertile, but only when people understand its moods. Too much water drowns the fields. Too little water leaves them exposed under a punishing sun. Salt can rise in the soil. Marshes can feed communities with fish, reeds, birds, and wild resources. But they can also swallow boundaries and make permanent settlement difficult. In the deep past, the coastline of the Persian Gulf lay farther inland than it does today, and the lower Mesopotamian plain was a changing world of estuaries, lagoons, marshes, river mouths, and silt. To live there was not simply to occupy a natural paradise. It was to negotiate with water every season. Yet somewhere in this difficult landscape, people began creating patterns that would later become unmistakably urban. They built in mud brick, the material of the plain, fragile and endlessly reusable. They gathered around special buildings that seemed to have carried religious or communal importance. They produced painted pottery in styles recognizable across wide distances. They farmed, herded, fished, wove, shaped clay, worked reeds, moved goods, and probably managed water with increasing care. Their world was not a city-state system like later Sumer. It was not an empire. It was not ruled by famous monarchs whose monuments still dominate museums. Its power was quieter and perhaps more communal, though no single explanation fully accounts for this. The striking thing is not that the Ubaid world resembles later civilization in every detail. It is that so many ingredients are already there, arranged in a form older than the classic image of civilization itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not one of a lost empire glittering with gold, nor a vanished kingdom destroyed in one dramatic night. It is stranger than that because it asks how civilization can be forgotten, even when its foundations remain everywhere beneath later history. The Ubaid did not vanish behind a single catastrophe. No burned palace marks their end. No army appears in the evidence as the clear destroyer of their world. Instead, they seem to fade by becoming part of what came after. Their villages and sacred centres, their habits of building, their use of symbols, their networks of exchange, and their ways of organising labour flowed into the later development of Mesopotamian urban life. When Sumer stepped into the light of writing, it stood on ground already prepared by people whose names were gone. This creates one of the most fascinating problems in ancient history. Civilizations are often remembered because they speak loudly. They build stone monuments, record victories, carve names into hard surfaces, or preserve texts in quantities large enough for later scholars to reconstruct their world. The Ubaid world speaks softly. Its monuments are made of mud brick. Its documents, if it had any in a form that does not survive, are lost. Its identity is visible through repeated patterns rather than written declarations. A temple platform at Eridu, a painted ceramic vessel, a figurine with strange features, a distribution of settlement sizes, a network stretching from southern Iraq toward northern Mesopotamia and the Gulf. These are the pieces from which the story must be assembled. It is a civilization seen in silhouette, and the silhouette is both compelling and uncertain. The old habit of calling Sumer the first civilization is not entirely wrong if the word is tied to writing, dense urbanism, and named political institutions. Sumer remains one of the earliest literate urban civilizations in the world, and its importance is enormous. But if civilization means the slow formation of complex social life, shared religious spaces, specialized production, long-distance exchange, engineered landscapes, and communities large enough to require new forms of coordination, then the beginning lies deeper. It lies in the centuries before writing, in a period when people were already learning to live beyond the scale of small villages. The forgotten civilization older than Sumer is not forgotten, because it was insignificant. It is forgotten because it came before the tools that usually preserve memory. Even the name Eridu carries a kind of echo. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembered Eridu as an ancient and sacred place, sometimes treated as one of the oldest cities, a place connected with deep beginnings. Archaeology shows that Eridu's roots reach far back into the Ubaid period, where a sequence of early temples was built and rebuilt on the same spot. This does not prove that later myths preserve exact historical memory, and scholars still debate the relationship between archaeological Eridu and the sacred Eridu of later texts. But the overlap is suggestive. In a land where cities built themselves upward through time, where one sacred building might stand upon the remains of another, memory could become layered like the mound itself. The past was not erased all at once. It was buried, reused, reimagined, and eventually renamed. The story therefore begins not with Sumer's kings, but with the nameless builders before them. It begins with people standing in a southern landscape of water, mud, reeds, cattle, fish, heat, and horizon, slowly making a world more connected and complex than any simple village. It begins in a place where the first signs of large communal life are humble enough to be missed. Clay walls dissolving back into earth, pottery patterns carried across distance, and sacred buildings rising from the plain before history learned to write itself down. To follow them is to enter the shadow beneath the first cities, where civilization is not born in a single moment, but gathers like silt in the channels of a river, layer by layer, until the ground itself has changed. Long before the southern cities became names in written history, the Fertile Crescent is already changing the pace of human life. The change does not happen everywhere at once, and it does not move in a clean line from wandering to farming to cities, as older histories sometimes imagined. It spreads unevenly across hills, plains, river valleys, marsh edges, and seasonal grasslands, where communities experiment with new relationships to plants, animals, water, and place. By the time the Ubaid world begins to take shape in southern Mesopotamia, people across the wider region have already spent thousands of years learning how to stay, how to store, how to cultivate, and how to return to the same ground with expectations that reach beyond a single season. Civilization, in this older landscape, begins less like an invention and more like a long negotiation. The Fertile Crescent curves from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia and into the Zagros foothills, a broad zone where wild ancestors of wheat, barley, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle could be found in different combinations. It is not a single garden, and it is not equally fertile in every place. Some areas receive winter rains, others depend on rivers, some are wooded and upland, others are open, dry, and exposed. What makes the region important is not that it offers effortless abundance, but that it contains many ecological edges. At those edges, human groups can hunt, gather, harvest wild cereals, manage animals, return to seasonal camps, and eventually build more permanent settlements. The evidence remains incomplete in many places. But what survives suggests that people are not simply forced into farming by hunger. They are drawn into it through opportunity, pressure, climate shifts, population growth, social habits, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge. This matters because the Ubaid world does not appear from an empty plain. It inherits a deep background of settled and semi-settled life. Earlier communities in the northern and central zones of Mesopotamia had already built villages, stored grain, domesticated animals, and developed traditions of pottery and architecture. In some regions, people had lived in substantial settlements long before the first Ubaid temples rose from southern mud brick. The world before Sumer is therefore not a blank prelude. It is a mosaic of experiments, some successful, some temporary, some absorbed into later traditions. The southern alluvial plain, however, presents a different challenge from the foothills and rain-fed zones. There, farming depends less on rainfall and more on the management of river water. The land promises enormous fertility, but only if people can work together to guide water into fields and keep it from destroying them. During the millennia before the Ubaid florescence, climate and sea level are also changing. After the end of the last ice age, warmer conditions reshape coastlines, river systems, vegetation zones, and human possibilities. The Persian Gulf Basin, lower and broader in earlier periods, fills as seas rise, river mouths migrate, marshes expand and contract. The southern Mesopotamian plain becomes a world of wetland resources and alluvial soils, but its surface is young, shifting, and often difficult for archaeologists to read today. Many early sites may be buried deeply under later silt or lost beneath changed waterways. This is one reason the earliest history of the Far South remains so elusive. Absence of evidence does not always mean absence of people, but it does mean that confident stories must be handled carefully. Scholars still debate how early communities settled the deepest South and how much has simply disappeared beneath the landscape itself. The people who eventually build the Ubaid world seem to understand a truth that later Mesopotamian civilizations will never escape. Water is both life and danger. A field of barley in southern Mesopotamia is not merely a field. It is the visible result of timing, labour, channels, embankments, digging, maintenance, and agreement. A canal is not only a technical feature, it is a social one. Someone must clear it. Someone must decide where the water goes. Someone must repair the banks after floods or neglect. Even small-scale irrigation encourages habits of cooperation and obligation. It does not automatically create kings or states, and no single explanation fully accounts for the later rise of hierarchy. But it does create recurring problems that isolated households cannot solve alone. In that sense, the landscape teaches organization before writing records it. The animals and plants of this world also reshape human time. Barley becomes especially important because it tolerates conditions that might challenge other crops, including some degree of soil salinity. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs connect households to meat, milk, hides, labour, dung for fuel, and social wealth. Reeds from the marshes provide building material, mats, baskets, boats, and countless everyday objects that rarely survive in the archaeological record. Fish and water birds supplement diets, and the marshes offer a richness that dry fields alone cannot provide. A lesser-known detail of early southern life is how much of it may have depended on materials that vanish almost completely. Read architecture. Woven containers, wooden tools, rope, matting, and boats made for shallow channels. What remains in the ground is often clay, stone, bone, and shell. But much of the living world was probably light, fibrous, flexible, and perishable. This creates a strange imbalance in memory. Archaeologists recover pottery sherds by the thousands, so pottery becomes the signature of cultures. Mud brick walls survive as stains, foundations, and collapsed masses, so architecture becomes visible in partial form. But a reed house, repaired season after season, may disappear almost without trace. A canal cleaned by generations may leave only a faint line or none at all if the river later shifts. A community's most common tools may have been made from materials that return to the earth too quickly to be counted. The people of the pre-Sumerian South are therefore not silent because they did little. They are silent because much of what they did was made from things that do not endure. As settlements grow more stable, the relationship between people and place becomes more intense. A village is not simply a cluster of houses. It is a field system, a burial ground, a memory of ancestors, a set of paths, a place where children learn the names of channels and animals, a store of grain against future uncertainty. Over time, staying in one place changes how people imagine the world. The horizon is no longer only a route, it becomes a boundary, a source of visitors, a direction from which goods arrive, a place beyond the known fields. The past also becomes physical. Each rebuilding leaves material below the feet of the living. Each generation stands slightly higher on the remains of the last. In the alluvial plain, where mud brick decays and is remade, settlement itself becomes a slow vertical archive. The Ubaid culture grows from this deeper transformation. Its people are not the first farmers, not the first villagers, and not the first builders in the ancient Near East. Their significance lies in the way they bring together several older developments in a difficult southern environment and create a cultural pattern broad enough to be recognized across regions. They live after the first great experiments with settled life, but before the fully urban world of written Sumer. They occupy the uncertain middle, and that is precisely why they matter. They show that civilization is not a door suddenly opened by writing or kingship. It is a threshold crossed gradually, with many footprints already pressed into the mud before anyone thinks to record a name. From this wider Fertile Crescent background, southern Mesopotamia begins to look less like the birthplace of everything and more like the place where older currents converge under unusual pressure. Rain-fed farming traditions, animal herding, pottery styles, ritual practices, exchange networks, and knowledge of water management all meet a landscape that demands coordination. The result is not yet Sumer, but it is no longer a simple village world either. It is a place where communities become more connected, where sacred centres begin to stand out, where shared styles travel farther than political control can be proven, and where the forgotten foundations of later civilization begin to take form. Out of this older world of villages, fields, marshes, and uncertain water, the Ubaid begins to gather almost quietly, without the clean beginning that later kingdoms sometimes claim for themselves. There is no known founder, no recorded conquest, no preserved proclamation announcing that a new people has arrived. Instead, archaeologists see a pattern forming through objects and settlements, a way of making pottery, a way of building houses, a way of arranging sacred space, a way of living across distance while still seeming connected by shared habits. The Ubaid world is not a nation in the modern sense, and it is not yet the city-state civilization of later Sumer. It is something harder to define, and therefore easier to overlook a broad cultural horizon, spreading over centuries, linking communities from the southern Mesopotamian plain toward the north, the Gulf, and beyond. The name comes from a site, Tel al-Ubaid, but the story is much larger than that one mound. It belongs to a long period, roughly beginning in the 6th millennium before the Common Era and continuing into the 5th. Though dates vary by region and phase, it stretches across a time when southern Mesopotamia is still becoming the landscape that later cities will occupy. The people of this world build mostly with mud brick, live from farming and herding, use the resources of marsh and river, and create distinctive painted pottery with dark geometric designs on pale or buff surfaces. These ceramics become one of the main clues by which archaeologists trace Ubaid presence and influence. Bowls, jars, and vessels break easily in life, but their fragments endure, scattered in the soil like a shattered map of forgotten connections. The pottery matters not because it is beautiful in a museum sense, though some of it is striking, but because it suggests shared ways of doing things. The designs are often restrained lines, bands, simple curves, chevrons, cross-hatching, and repeated shapes. They do not tell stories in the way later reliefs or written myths do, but they reveal choice, discipline, and convention. A potter shaping clay in one settlement is not merely producing a container. That potter is participating in a recognizable style, a visual language without words. When similar styles appear across wide areas, scholars must ask what they mean. Did people move? Did pots travel? Did ideas spread through marriage, exchange, imitation, ritual prestige, or a mixture of all these? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the spread, but the pattern is too strong to ignore. At the heart of the Ubaid world, especially in the south, settlement begins to show signs of increasing complexity. There are small villages, but also larger centres that seem to stand above the ordinary household level. Eridu is the most famous, partly because of its deep sequence of temple buildings, but it is not alone in showing that the Ubaid world has more structure than a scatter of independent farms. Sites such as Tel el-Wali, and others reveal communities with planned architecture, storage, craft activity, and social differences that are visible, though still debated. The houses are often built around central spaces, with rooms arranged in ways that suggest domestic organisation, and repeated architectural traditions. Some buildings are larger or more carefully made than others. These differences do not prove kingship, but they do suggest that status, role, and communal authority are beginning to matter in more formal ways. One of the most important features of Ubaid life is that it seems to grow through connection rather than sudden domination. Later Mesopotamian history is full of kings, armies, walls, rival cities, tribute, and conquest. The Ubaid world gives a different impression. Its influence spreads widely, but not through evidence of a single empire. There is no clear sign of one capital commanding the rest. Instead, there are regional variations within a shared cultural frame. Northern Ubaid sites do not simply copy the south in every detail. Local communities adapt styles and practices to their own landscapes, resources, and older traditions. This makes the Ubaid horizon feel less like a political takeover and more like a web flexible, uneven, resilient, and difficult to reduce to one cause. That web probably includes trade, but trade in this period should not be imagined only as merchants moving with ledgers and formal contracts. There's no writing yet to record such things. Exchange may happen through household networks, seasonal movement, ritual gatherings, marriage alliances, visiting craftspeople, or chains of small transactions passing goods from hand to hand over long distances. Materials that southern Mesopotamia lacks must come from elsewhere. The alluvial plain provides mud, reeds, fish, grain, and animals, but it has little stone, timber, or metal. This shortage becomes a powerful engine of connection. Communities in the south need things from beyond their flat horizon, and in needing them, they become part of a larger world. Obsidian, certain stones, shells, and later metals help reveal the reach of these early networks. What survives in the record suggests that even before writing, people know how to make distance useful. The Ubaid world also gathers around ritual. This is one of its most important and mysterious aspects. In later Sumer, temples become central institutions, with economic, political, and religious power intertwined. In the Ubaid period, the earliest steps toward this temple-centered tradition can already be seen, though cautiously. At Eridu, a sequence of buildings interpreted as temples shows repeated rebuilding over generations. The architecture changes through time, but the persistence of sacred location is striking. People return to the same place, rebuild on the same axis, and preserve a focus that outlives individual lifetimes. This suggests that community identity may have been anchored not only in fields and houses, but in places set apart from ordinary life. Scholars still debate the exact nature of these buildings and the rituals performed there, but the continuity itself is a powerful clue. A lesser-known and often haunting detail of the Ubaid world is its figurines. Some small clay figures from Ubaid contexts have elongated heads, narrow bodies, and unusual facial features that have attracted much popular speculation. Fringe theories sometimes detach them from archaeology and turn them into fantasies, but there is no need for that. Their strangeness is more interesting when kept inside the human world that made them. They may relate to identity, ritual, fertility, household practice, social memory, or beliefs that cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Their forms remind us that ancient people did not necessarily represent the body as modern viewers expect. They shaped clay according to symbols, conventions, and meanings that are now partly lost. The figures are not evidence of anything supernatural. They are evidence of imagination, and perhaps of a symbolic world far richer than the surviving record can explain. As the Ubaid horizon spreads, daily life is also becoming more coordinated. Fields must be worked, animals must be managed, canals or irrigation channels must be dug and maintained where farming requires them. Mud brick must be formed, dried, carried, stacked, repaired, and replaced. Pottery must be produced and fired, food must be stored, Boats or reed craft may move through waterways, fish must be caught, nets repaired, baskets woven, grain ground, children cared for, and the dead remembered. None of this looks dramatic in isolation, but civilization is often built from repeated work before it is displayed in monuments. The Ubaid world's achievement lies partly in this accumulation of ordinary coordination. It is a society learning how to make cooperation durable. The social structure of this world remains difficult to define. There are hints of inequality, but not the stark royal burials or massive elite monuments that appear in some later societies. There are special buildings, but not palaces in the later sense. There is long-distance exchange, but no written bureaucracy. There is cultural unity, but no proven empire. This ambiguity has led scholars to different interpretations. Some see Ubaid society as relatively egalitarian compared with later Mesopotamia, organized through households and communal ritual. Others argue that leadership and hierarchy are already emerging, even if they are not yet expressed through kingship. The evidence supports caution. Authority may have been situational, ritual, economic, or kin-based. It may have differed from region to region. What matters is that the social world is no longer simple. It is becoming layered, even if the layers are not yet carved into stone. By the end of the Ubaid period, the ancient South has changed. The foundations are not yet those of the great literate city-states, but the direction is visible. Settlements are larger and more interconnected. Sacred centers have deeper histories. Pottery styles and architectural ideas have spread across remarkable distances. Communities have learned to work with difficult water and limited local resources. They have developed patterns of exchange and identity that reach beyond one village. They have begun to create the conditions in which later urban civilization can emerge. The Ubaid does not stand in the spotlight because it leaves no epic voice behind. But in the long story of Mesopotamia, it is the gathering before the storm of cities, the low murmur before writing, the slow tightening of human networks before Sumer gives those networks names. At Eridu, the forgotten world becomes visible in layers. The site rises today as a mound in the southern Iraqi plain, weathered by time, emptied of the life that once moved around it. But beneath its broken surface lies one of the most important sequences in the story of civilization before Sumer. Here, mud brick buildings were razed, used, abandoned, levelled, and rebuilt again over centuries. Each new structure stood partly upon the memory of the older one. Each rebuilding lifted the sacred place slightly higher above the plain. What began as modest architecture became a deep vertical record of repeated devotion, communal labour, and social continuity. In a landscape where mud brick returns easily to dust, the decision to rebuild in the same place again and again is never meaningless. Eridu is often treated in later Mesopotamian tradition as a place of beginnings, and archaeology gives that reputation a strange weight. The earliest levels at the site belong to the Ubaid period, long before the full flowering of Sumerian urban life. They do not reveal a city in the later sense, with dense streets, bureaucratic archives, and royal institutions. Instead, they reveal something more elusive, a settlement focused around a special building tradition, with temples or temple-like structures occupying the same sacred zone through multiple phases. The earliest buildings are small, but they already show a concern with form and separation. Over time, the structures become more substantial, with central halls, side rooms, offering installations, and carefully arranged spaces. Scholars still debate the exact rituals performed there, but the buildings do not look like ordinary houses. They suggest that some places were already set apart. This is one of the essential steps in the long formation of Mesopotamian civilization. Before kings write their names, before scribes count grain on tablets, before cities compete for gods and territory, communities are already gathering around sacred architecture. The temple is not yet the vast ziggurat of later imagination, towering over a city like a mountain of brick. It begins more humbly, closer to the ground, made from the same mud as houses and field walls. Yet its meaning is different. It concentrates labour, it draws attention, it creates a point of return. It may store offerings, host rituals, organise seasonal gatherings, or embody the relationship between the community and forces they cannot fully control: water, fertility, death, weather, abundance, and danger. What survives in the record suggests that ritual space becomes one of the first ways complex society learns to recognise itself. The architecture of the Ubaid world is often understated, but it rewards close attention. Mud brick is not stone. It does not resist time heroically. It erodes, melts, cracks, and collapses when neglected. To build with it is to accept maintenance as part of life. Walls require repair, roofs need replacement, floors are resurfaced. Buildings are not permanent monuments in the Egyptian sense. They are living structures, kept alive by repeated work. This gives Ubaid settlements a rhythm that is easy to underestimate. The built environment is always being remade. Houses grow, shrink, shift, and dissolve. Sacred buildings, however, sometimes hold their position. That contrast matters. A temple rebuilt on the same spot says that one location has memory beyond the practical needs of shelter. Tel el-Aili, another important Ubaid site in southern Mesopotamia, helps broaden the picture beyond Eridu. Excavations there revealed early architecture that suggests planned settlement and communal organisation, including large buildings and carefully made mud brick structures. The site has been important in debates about the earliest development of southern Mesopotamian village life. Its remains show that Ubaid communities were not merely scattered huts beside fields. They could build with intention at a larger scale. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does for mud brick worlds, but the pattern is clear enough to challenge any simple image of primitive farmers waiting for Sumer to civilize them. These were communities already capable of planning space, mobilizing work, and repeating architectural traditions across generations. The houses of the Ubaid period also reveal a social world more organized than the surviving ruins first suggest. Many domestic buildings follow tripartite plans, with a central hall or main space flanked by smaller rooms. This arrangement appears in various forms across Ubaid sites, and later becomes part of a broader Mesopotamian architectural tradition. A house is not just shelter. It is a machine for daily life, storing grain, preparing food, sleeping, working, receiving visitors, protecting tools, raising children, and marking household identity. The repetition of house forms suggests shared expectations about how life should be arranged. At the same time, differences in size and construction hint that not every household stands in the same position. Inequality may not yet be dramatic, but sameness and difference exist side by side. The surprising detail is how much of this world is built from almost nothing that seems monumental at first glance. Mud, reeds, water, straw, and human hands make the physical landscape of settlement. Bricks are shaped in moulds or by hand, dried in the sun, and stacked into walls. Reed mats may strengthen surfaces. Roofs likely use reeds, wood where available, and packed earth. Floors are plastered or tamped. Ovens and hearths anchor domestic work. Courtyards and open areas create breathing space in the heat. The result is a world of earth colours and sharp light, where buildings rise low from the plain and blend with it. Later ruins can make such places appear lifeless, but when inhabited they would have been full of texture smoke drifting from ovens, animals moving near walls, stored baskets, drying fish, stacked fuel, painted vessels, woven mats, and people passing through narrow spaces shaped by habit. Sacred centres transform this everyday material into something more lasting. At Eridu, The temple sequence shows not simply construction, but continuity of attention. One building gives way to another. Plans are altered, enlarged, formalized. Platforms appear, niches, buttresses, and interior arrangements become more complex. Later Mesopotamian temples often feature bent axis approaches, altars, offering tables, and carefully controlled movement through space. The origins of these traditions are debated, but the Ubaid levels show early steps toward the idea that sacred architecture should guide bodies and attention. A person entering such a building would not experience it like a house. The layout itself may have shaped behavior, creating a sense of approach, pause, offering, and separation from ordinary life. This raises a difficult question: who controls such places? The answer is not clear. Later Mesopotamian temples are powerful institutions, tied to land, labor, storage, redistribution, and political authority. In the Ubaid period, the evidence is thinner. There may have been ritual specialists, elders, household leaders, or emerging elites connected to temple activity. There may have been communal participation rather than centralized control. Scholars still debate whether the Ubaid temple is already an institution of hierarchy or a shared religious focus that helps hold communities together. Perhaps it is both, depending on time and place. Ritual can unite a community, but it can also create roles that some people occupy more permanently than others. A person who manages offerings, schedules ceremonies, stores surplus, or speaks for tradition may gain influence without needing a crown. In this sense, mud brick temples are not only religious structures, they are early theatres of social organisation. They bring people together at predictable times. They require labour beyond the household. They may receive goods from fields, herds, and waterways. They create obligations and expectations. They preserve memory by standing where earlier sacred buildings stood. Even without writing, such institutions can remember. The building itself tells the community where to gather, what matters, and what has mattered before. Its walls are not records in words, but they are records in place. The Ubaid sacred centre also reveals a different kind of power from the one modern audiences often expect in ancient history. There are no giant statues of rulers here, no carved battle scenes, no triumphal inscriptions. The authority is quieter, embedded in repetition. It lies in the ability to bring people back to the same mound, to convince generations that this spot deserves rebuilding, to organize hands enough to raise walls that do not feed anyone directly. That last point is crucial. A temple is not a field. It does not produce grain by itself. It consumes labor. For a community living close to environmental uncertainty, investing work in sacred architecture means that the building answers a need deeper than immediate survival. It creates order, meaning, and perhaps negotiation with forces that determine survival in less visible ways. At the same time, the Ubaid world remains grounded in practical reality. The sacred centre cannot be separated from the fields and marshes around it. Offerings come from food production. Labour comes from households. Brickmaking depends on mud, straw, water, and dry weather. If canals fail, if harvests shrink, if animals sicken, ritual life changes too. The temple's importance may grow precisely because life is uncertain. In southern Mesopotamia, where river behavior can decide abundance or hunger, communal ritual may have offered a way to frame risk. It does not mean people lacked practical knowledge. They understood fields, animals, seasons, and materials intimately. But practical skill and sacred meaning often develop together. Ancient communities do not divide the world into modern categories as neatly as later observers do. This is why the early Ubaid centres are so important. They show complexity before the familiar signs of state power. They reveal that the road to urban civilization runs through places where people gather, build, rebuild, and remember together. The great cities of Sumer will later raise temples on massive platforms and bind gods to civic identity. Their rulers will claim favor from divine powers. Their scribes will count goods moving through institutional storehouses. But beneath that later world lies an older habit, the repeated making of sacred space in mud brick, on the same ground, in communities still small enough to be felt as human, but large enough to need something beyond kinship alone. By following the walls of Eridu and the planned spaces of other Ubaid settlements, the forgotten civilization becomes less like a shadow and more like a foundation. It is not yet the world of written history, but it is already a world of meaningful architecture. Its people are shaping Earth into memory. They are turning settlement into tradition. They are discovering that a community can be anchored not only by the houses where people sleep, but by the places where they gather to face what they cannot control. In those mud brick centres, older than Sumer's written fame, the first outlines of Mesopotamia's sacred urban imagination begin to rise from the plain. The Ubaid world does not grow beside water in a simple way. It grows inside water's changing moods. To imagine southern Mesopotamia before Sumer, the mind has to remove the sharp modern boundary between land and sea and replace it with something more unstable. Marsh, lagoon, mudflat, reed bed, river mouth, shallow channel, and low islands of settlement rising only slightly above the wet plain. The Persian Gulf coastline was not fixed where it is today. Over long periods, sea level, river sediment, and shifting channels remade the lower landscape. So the earliest communities of the far south lived in a world that was neither fully dry nor fully marine. It was a place where boats could matter as much as paths, where reeds could be as important as timber, and where the line between field, marsh, and open water had to be learned through experience rather than drawn on a map. This watery setting helps explain why the Ubaid civilization is both visible and elusive. Some sites are preserved as mounds, while others may be buried beneath alluvium, erased by channel movement, or hidden under later deposits. Archaeologists working in southern Iraq are not simply reading a stable landscape. They are trying to reconstruct a vanished geography. Rivers that once carried water near a settlement may now be far away. Marshes that sustained life may have shifted, dried, or returned. Ancient Gulf waters once reached farther inland than the present shoreline, though the exact timing and local effects remain debated. What survives in the record suggests that Ubaid communities were deeply adapted to an amphibious world, one where survival depended on using water's richness while resisting its unpredictability. The marshes offered extraordinary resources. Reeds grew in dense stands and could be cut for building, roofing, matting, baskets, fences, boat-making, and fuel. Fish-filled channels and lagoons. Birds migrated through wetlands, leaving eggs, meat, feathers, and bone. Wild plants and animals supplemented cultivated food. Clay lay ready for bricks and pottery. Bitumen, found in parts of Mesopotamia and traded through wider networks, could waterproof baskets, boats and containers, cattle, sheep. Goats and pigs could be raised in different ecological zones around settlements. Barley fields could be watered by river channels and managed flooding. In such a world, the difference between farmer, fisher, herder, builder, and boatman may not have been as rigid as later categories suggest. Households likely drew from many sources, shifting their work with season, water level, and need. A lesser-known detail of this early southern world is how central reed technology may have been to life, even though it leaves so little behind. Stone temples and carved monuments impress the modern eye because they survive. Reed architecture, by contrast, can vanish almost completely, yet it may have shaped some of the earliest forms of settlement and movement in the marshy south. A reed house can be built quickly, repaired often and adapted to wet ground. Reed bundles can form walls, roofs, fences, rafts, mats, and storage containers. In later southern Mesopotamian marsh communities, reed construction became a highly sophisticated tradition, and while direct continuity over thousands of years must be treated carefully, the environmental logic is ancient. The Ubaid people lived in a land where reeds were not a poor substitute for wood. They were one of the great materials of civilization. Water also connected communities to distances beyond sight. Southern Mesopotamia lacks many raw materials that complex societies need or desire. It has no abundant building stone, little quality timber, and limited access to metals. This absence could have been a weakness, but it also encouraged exchange. The rivers and gulf created routes by which goods, ideas, and people could travel. Boats moving through channels, marshes, and coastal waters may have carried pottery, grain, fish products, reeds, textiles, shells, stone, bitumen, and other materials from one community to another. The evidence remains incomplete because boats rarely survive, and trade without writing leaves few direct records. Yet the spread of Ubaid-related material across a wide zone, including regions around the Gulf, suggests that waterborne movement played a major role in creating the cultural horizon. The Gulf itself was not an empty edge of the world, it was a corridor. Ubaid pottery and related materials have been found at sites beyond southern Mesopotamia, including areas of the Arabian Gulf, showing that contact extended across considerable distances. Scholars still debate the nature of these contacts. Some may represent small groups of people moving, perhaps fishers, traders, or settlers. Some may reflect exchange with local communities adopting foreign pottery styles or objects. Some may have involved seasonal journeys rather than permanent colonies. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, but the important point is that the Ubaid world was not isolated in the southern plain. Its watery horizon opened outward. This is one reason the term forgotten civilization can be misleading if imagined as a single lost kingdom. The Ubaid world is better understood as a networked way of life. Its heartlands lie in Mesopotamia, but its influence ripples outward through exchange, imitation, and contact along the Gulf. Ubaid pottery appears in places where local communities had their own traditions and landscapes. The pots do not prove that southern Mesopotamians ruled those places. They do show that objects are styles. And perhaps people moved across water. A painted bowl found far from its place of origin is not just a container. It is evidence of a relationship. It suggests that someone valued the object, the contents it carried, the style it displayed, or the connection it represented. Inside southern Mesopotamia itself, water management gradually becomes one of the great engines of social change. Early irrigation does not have to begin as a massive state project. It can start with small channels, field ditches, embankments, and local cooperation. But even small systems require coordination. Water must be diverted at the right time. Channels must be kept clear of silt. Boundaries must be negotiated. Upstream and downstream users may have conflicting needs. Floods can destroy what people carefully build. Drought can expose the limits of planning. As communities grow, these problems become more complicated. The Ubaid period may show early forms of the cooperative habits that later Mesopotamian societies expand into large-scale irrigation administration. The evidence does not allow a simple claim that canals created civilization by themselves, but it strongly suggests that water demanded organized labor long before kings and scribes formalized that labor in written records. The ancient South's abundance was therefore conditional. It could feed dense populations, but only through attention and effort. In years of favorable water, fields might yield enough grain to support craft specialists, ritual gatherings, storage, and exchange. In harsher years, the same landscape could become dangerous. Soil salinity, caused in part by irrigation and evaporation in arid conditions, would later become a serious problem in Mesopotamian agriculture. How early and how severely it affected Ubaid communities remains debated, but the basic risk was present in the environment. The river gives fertility, then leaves salt behind if water is poorly drained or fields are repeatedly irrigated under intense heat. The land that seems to promise civilization also carries the seeds of long-term strain. This tension between richness and fragility gives the Ubaid world its character. Its people do not simply live on fertile ground. They live in a landscape that rewards cooperation and punishes neglect. A canal left uncleared can fail. A field badly watered can decline. A settlement built too low can flood. A route through marsh can disappear. A reed bed can be both shelter and obstacle. Such conditions encourage knowledge that is practical, local, and collective. Children grow up learning the difference between safe ground and treacherous mud, between useful channels and stagnant water, between seasonal abundance and looming scarcity. Older people carry memories of floods, fish runs, harvest failures, and places where the river used to flow. In a world without writing, landscape memory lives in bodies, habits, and stories that archaeology can only glimpse. The sacred centres discussed earlier may have drawn strength from this watery uncertainty. A temple in the Ubaid south stands not apart from the environment, but within its pressures. If water determines harvests, and harvests determine survival, then ritual attention to fertility, order, and cosmic balance would not be decorative. It would be central. The same community that digs channels may also bring offerings. The same hands that shape bricks may shape figurines or painted vessels. Practical labour and symbolic life are woven together, because the world itself offers no guarantee that human work will succeed. Scholars still debate the meanings of Ubaid ritual, but it is hard to imagine sacred life in southern Mesopotamia without water at its centre, whether openly represented or silently assumed. In this sense, the sea and marshes did not merely feed the first towns, they taught them how to become towns. They made isolation difficult and connection useful. They supplied materials that could be transformed into architecture, transport, storage, and daily tools. They forced people to organize labor and remember seasonal rhythms. They link the southern plain to the Gulf and beyond. They made the Ubaid world wide without making it imperial. Later Sumerian civilization would inherit this watery foundation cities beside canals, temples rising above floodplains, myths of primeval waters, economies dependent on irrigation, boats moving goods through the veins of the land. But the older pattern was already there, formed by nameless communities whose lives followed the shifting edge between earth and water. The forgotten civilization older than Sumer is therefore not buried only beneath later cities. It is buried beneath a changed landscape. Its world was made of channels that no longer run, marsh routes that no longer guide boats, shorelines that have moved, reed buildings that have vanished, and fields whose ancient boundaries have dissolved. To recover it is to imagine civilization not as stone rising from dry land, but as mud brick, reed, fish, barley, and boat, all held together by labour and memory. Before Sumer wrote its first signs into clay, the people of the Ubaid had already learned that water could gather human life into something larger than a village, and that the same water could erase the traces almost as soon as they were made. Behind the temples, pottery, canals, and wide movements of Ubaid influence, there are people whose names are completely lost. They do not appear as kings, generals, scribes, or heroes. They survive only through the things their hands touched: a worn grinding stone, a storage jar, a hearth blackened by use, animal bones discarded after meals, clay figurines shaped and left behind, a floor repaired one more time before the house was abandoned. The Ubaid world is often discussed through settlements and cultural horizons, but its true foundation is the daily life of households. Before there are famous rulers in Mesopotamia, before palaces and royal tombs dominate the imagination, civilization grows from ordinary labour repeated with extraordinary patience. A day in a Ubaid settlement begins with practical demands. Grain must be ground, fires must be started, animals must be checked, water must be carried, fields must be inspected, and tools must be repaired. The landscape offers little room for idleness. In the heat of southern Mesopotamia, the rhythm of work follows light, season, and water. Barley fields need attention at certain times of year. Herd animals must be moved, fed, protected, or milked. Fishers may set nets in channels or marsh edges. Reeds are cut, bundled, dried, and carried. Clay is dug and prepared for pottery or bricks. Food is cooked in ovens or over hearths, while stored grain is watched carefully because surplus is the difference between confidence and hunger. What survives in the record suggests a society where household labour and communal work overlap constantly. The Ubaid household is not a small private world sealed away from the larger community. It is part of a wider system of exchange, obligation, ritual, and seasonal cooperation. A family may farm its own plots, but water management draws it into shared labour. A household may make its own food, but pottery styles connect it to a broader cultural tradition. A house may store goods, but offerings or communal events may move some of those goods into sacred spaces. The tripartite houses found at some Ubaid sites suggest regular ideas about domestic space, but the people inside those houses likely lived in ways that changed with age, gender, skill, status, and kinship. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because textiles, baskets, wooden tools, and reed objects rarely survive. But the traces are enough to reveal a world dense with work. Food is one of the clearest ways to enter that world. Barley is central, not because it is glamorous, but because it is reliable under difficult conditions. It can be made into bread, porridge, and beer-like fermented drinks, though the exact forms of early Ubaid food preparation are reconstructed cautiously from wider Mesopotamian patterns and archaeological remains. Wheat may also appear, along with legumes, dates in later contexts, milk products, meat, fish, and gathered wetland resources. Animals provide more than food. Sheep and goats supply wool or hair, hides, milk, dung, and meat. Cattle offer power, prestige, and practical value. Pigs thrive in some wetter environments. Fish bones and aquatic remains remind us that the marshes were not scenery, they were a larder. A lesser-known detail is how important dung may have been as fuel in places where wood was limited. The smell of smoke in a Ubaid settlement may have come not from great forests, but from the careful use of animal waste, reeds, and other available materials. The work of making food is also the work of making society. Grinding grain is physically demanding and time-consuming. It wears down stones and bodies alike. Repeated kneeling, lifting, carrying, and grinding leave marks on skeletons in many ancient farming populations. Though connecting specific patterns to every Ubaid community must be done carefully, cooking, storing, and distributing food-shape relationships within the household. Who controls stored grain matters. Who prepares meals matters. Who has access to meat or special foods during gatherings matters. In a world before written accounts, these ordinary details are difficult to see clearly, but they are not minor. They are the daily mechanics of power, care, and survival. Craft production adds another layer. Ubaid pottery does not appear by accident. Clay must be selected, cleaned, shaped, dried, painted, and fired. Firing requires fuel, timing, and knowledge of temperature, even if kilns are simple by later standards. The painted designs that identify Ubaid pottery across regions imply learned skill and shared taste. Some vessels may be made within households, while others may involve more specialized production. Scholars still debate how far specialization had developed in different phases and places. The answer likely varies. A small community might produce much of what it needs locally, while larger centers may support more skilled or regular craft workers. Over time, the existence of recognizable styles suggests that certain people became especially good at turning clay into objects that carried both function and identity. Other crafts are harder to recover because their materials vanish. Textile production may have been extremely important, especially as herding developed and fibers became available. Spinning, weaving, mat making, basketry, rope making, and reed construction would have filled daily life, but most of their products decay. Archaeology often gives stone tools and pottery a louder voice than cloth and fibre, even though cloth and fibre may have occupied far more hours of human labour. A woven mat on a floor, a reed basket used for grain, a net used in marsh fishing, or a textile wrapped around a body could shape life profoundly and still leave almost nothing. This imbalance makes the Ubaid world seem more ceramic and architectural than it really was. In life, it was probably full of soft, flexible, perishable things. Gender roles in Ubaid society cannot be reconstructed with certainty, and it would be misleading to impose modern assumptions too confidently. Farming, herding, childcare, craft production, food preparation, ritual activity, and exchange all require many kinds of labour. Some tasks may have been strongly associated with women, men, age groups, or kin roles, but the evidence does not allow a simple universal map. Figurines, burials, tools, and household layouts offer clues, yet they remain difficult to interpret. What can be said with more confidence is that social life depended on cooperation across the household. Children learned by watching and helping. Elders carried memory. Adults moved between domestic tasks and communal obligations. The rise of complexity did not happen above ordinary people. It passed through their bodies, routines, and relationships. Burials offer one of the most intimate but challenging windows into Ubaid life. Some Ubaid cemeteries and graves suggest care for the dead. Though burial practices vary, bodies may be placed with pottery or small goods, and the treatment of the dead can reveal ideas about identity, kinship, and memory. Yet burial evidence is uneven, and grave goods do not always translate easily into social rank. A simple burial may belong to someone deeply valued. A richer burial may reflect family status, ritual role, or community practice rather than personal wealth alone. Scholars still debate how to read inequality in Ubaid mortuary evidence. The dead speak through arrangement, position, and objects, but they do not explain themselves. One famous and often misunderstood group of finds comes from Ubaid period figurines, especially the so-called lizard-like or ophidian figurines found in some contexts. Their elongated heads, narrow faces, and unusual eyes have inspired wild modern claims, but those claims are unsupported. The figurines are human-made ritual or symbolic objects, not evidence of non-human visitors or hidden races. Their power lies in what they reveal about Ubaid imagination. Some appear to represent bodies in stylized ways, sometimes with details that may relate to dress, adornment, motherhood, identity, or ritual transformation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for them. Still, their presence reminds us that daily life was not only practical. The same people who dug channels and ground barley also shaped symbols whose meanings now hover just beyond reach. Social status is visible in the Ubaid world, but not yet in the overwhelming form seen in later states. Some houses are larger, some buildings are more formal, some objects travel farther. Some people may have access to special materials or ritual roles. But the archaeological record does not show kings ruling from palaces. This has led many scholars to imagine Ubaid society as relatively less stratified than later Sumer, though not necessarily equal. Influence may have rested in households, elders, ritual specialists, skilled craftspeople, or those able to coordinate labour and exchange. Authority may have been embedded in relationships rather than displayed as command. A person who knows how to settle water disputes, organise canal repair, lead ceremonies, arrange marriages, or manage stored goods can be powerful without leaving a crown in the ground. This is what makes the phrase people before kings so important. The Ubaid world shows that many foundations of civilization can appear before formal monarchy. Settlements can grow, temples can be rebuilt, trade can spread, crafts can become recognizable, water can be managed, communities can develop shared symbols. None of this requires the immediate appearance of a ruler whose name dominates history. Later, Mesopotamia will remember kings because writing and monuments favour them. The earlier record favours things houses, pots, bones, walls, hearths, and tools. It reveals a form of civilization made less by command than by cumulative participation. The ordinary people of the Ubaid world probably never think of themselves as living before Sumer. They do not know they are a prelude. They live in the present of their own fields, homes, rituals, fears, and expectations. A mother smoothing wet clay, a child carrying reeds, an elder watching the water level in a channel, a potter painting dark lines on a pale vessel, a herder counting animals near dusk, a group of workers repairing a mud brick wall after rain. These are not background details to history, they are the substance from which history is made. The later rise of cities depends on them so completely that they almost disappear into it. By looking closely at Ubaid daily life, the forgotten civilization becomes more human and more mysterious at the same time. It is easier to understand because its needs are recognizable: food, shelter, water, safety, memory, belonging. It is harder to understand because its inner meanings are mostly lost. No diary explains how an Ubaid household understood its gods. No inscription tells how labour was negotiated, or how a child learned the pattern on a pot. The evidence gives outlines, not voices. Yet those outlines are enough to show that before kings stood at the centre of Mesopotamian history, communities had already built a world strong enough to carry them. In the long shadow beneath Sumer, the first civilization was not only made by temples and canals, it was made by people whose names vanished, but whose habits endured. As the Ubaid world grows more connected, its most important buildings are not palaces, fortresses, or royal tombs. They are temples, or at least buildings that archaeologists carefully interpret as temple-like sacred spaces. This detail changes the entire shape of the story. Later civilization is often imagined through kings, armies, taxation, and written commands. But in the older layers beneath Sumer, authority seems to gather first around ritual. The sacred centre rises before the throne becomes visible. The place of offering appears before the palace. The repeated rebuilding of holy ground comes before the written name of any ruler. This does not mean the Ubaid world is peaceful, equal, or simple. It means power is still wearing older clothing. At Eridu, the pattern is especially striking. Building after building appears in sequence, each one connected to the same sacred location, each one preserving the importance of a place through time. The structures become larger and more formal as generations pass. Their plans suggest separation from ordinary domestic space, with central rooms, side chambers, installations, and arrangements that seem designed for controlled movement and special activity. What exactly happens inside remains uncertain. No written liturgy survives. No priest leaves a record of offerings. No image explains the ritual scene in full. Yet the architecture itself speaks in a limited but powerful way. It says that this was not merely a house. It says that people returned here because the place mattered. The temple in early Mesopotamia is never only a religious idea floating above daily life, it is physical, economic, and social. It requires mud brick, labour, planning, maintenance, and repeated collective investment. A community that builds such a structure must decide, formally or informally, that some labour will be diverted away from immediate household needs. Someone shapes the bricks, someone carries them, someone prepares plaster or clay, someone supplies food for workers, or the workers bring their own from households that accept the obligation. Even a modest temple represents coordination. It is a social act made visible in architecture. This is why temples without empires matter so much. In the Ubaid period, there is little evidence for a centralized state ruling southern Mesopotamia. There are no clear royal palaces, no administrative archives, no carved declarations of conquest. Yet sacred buildings exist, and their persistence suggests a form of authority that does not need kingship to function. It may rest in ritual specialists, elders, prominent households, lineage groups, or community assemblies whose exact nature remains invisible. Scholars still debate how leadership worked in Ubaid communities, but the evidence suggests that organized public life is already emerging. The temple becomes one of the earliest places where the public life takes shape. Ritual authority can be subtle. It does not always command through force. It may guide through tradition. A person who knows the correct timing of ceremonies, the proper handling of offerings, or the remembered meaning of a sacred place can hold influence. A family associated with temple service over generations may gain prestige. A group that manages storage connected to ritual gatherings may control resources without appearing as rulers in the later sense. Power can accumulate quietly around responsibility, especially when responsibility concerns the relationship between the community and the forces that sustain it. In southern Mesopotamia, those forces are never abstract. They are water, fertility, grain, animals, birth, death, storms, marshes, and the uncertain behaviour of rivers. The sacred centre may also help solve a social problem created by settlement itself. A small band can rely heavily on kinship and personal familiarity, but a growing village or town requires wider forms of trust. People must cooperate with others beyond the immediate household. They must share labour on canals, participate in seasonal tasks, settle disputes, exchange goods, and respond to crisis. Ritual gives such cooperation a deeper frame. When people gather at the same sacred place, bring offerings, witness ceremonies, or rebuild a temple together, they're not only performing belief, they are rehearsing community. The temple tells them that they belong to something larger than the house. This larger belonging may explain the remarkable continuity of sacred locations. A building can collapse, but the place remains charged with memory. The ground itself becomes an archive. Beneath each new floor lies the older floor. Beneath each wall lies the line of another wall. The community may not need written history to know that ancestors stood there before. The mound preserves that knowledge in its height and material. Each rebuilding turns memory into labour. Each layer deepens the authority of the place. By the time later Sumerian tradition remembers Eridu as ancient, the site has already been ancient for a very long time. Yet it would be too simple to imagine these temples as gentle communal centres untouched by inequality. Ritual can unite, but it can also divide. Some people enter spaces that others may not. Some handle offerings while others provide them. Some know sacred knowledge while others receive it from a distance. Some households may gain status by sponsoring labour or supplying goods. The evidence remains incomplete, and Ubaid society does not show the sharp royal hierarchy of later periods. But the temple may be one of the places where social difference first becomes durable. In the beginning, power does not need a crown. It needs a role that others recognize. The absence of palaces is therefore not the absence of complexity. It may show a world where authority is still embedded in sacred and communal institutions, rather than separated into royal power. Later Mesopotamian cities will bind temples and rulers together in complicated ways. Kings will build temples to prove devotion and legitimacy. Temple estates will hold land, workers, animals, and stores. Scribes will record offerings and distributions. But the Ubaid evidence suggests that the sacred institution is older than the fully developed state. The temple is not a decorative part of civilization after politics appears. It is one of the paths through which politics slowly becomes possible. There is also a quieter human dimension. For the people of an Ubaid settlement, the temple may have shaped the emotional map of the world. It is where harvest anxiety becomes offering, where death becomes memory, where water's danger is placed inside ritual order, where the community gathers when ordinary life feels too fragile. It may have been linked to feasting, seasonal ceremonies, offerings of food or goods, and acts of repair that tied generations together. No single explanation fully accounts for the surviving evidence, but the repeated attention to sacred buildings suggests that these places held the weight of more than belief alone. They held the community's need to endure. In this older world, before empires, before royal inscriptions, before armies become the loudest voice of history, the temple stands as a different kind of monument. It is made of mud brick, vulnerable to weather, and dependent on human care. Its survival through rebuilding mirrors the society around it, fragile in material, strong in repetition. The Ubaid people may not have left texts explaining their gods, but they left the pattern of returning to sacred ground. That pattern passes forward into Sumer, where temples become the hearts of cities and divine ownership shapes urban life. The kings come later, the scribes come later, the names come later. First comes the mound, the offering place, the rebuilt wall, and the belief that a community must gather around something greater than itself. Long before writing fixes names, prices, debts, and shipments into clay, the Ubaid world is already moving goods across distance. Its people do not need tablets to know that the southern plain lacks many things. They can see it in the land itself. Mud is everywhere. Reeds are plentiful. Fish, grain, animals, and clay can sustain life. But good stone is rare. Large timber is scarce. Metals do not lie waiting in the alluvium. Certain shells, hard stones, obsidian, and valued minerals must come from elsewhere. This absence becomes one of the hidden engines of connection. The Ubaid world grows not only because people settle in fertile places, but because they learn how to reach beyond them. Trade before writing is difficult to reconstruct because it leaves no invoices. No merchant writes down the weight of a basket, the name of a boatman, or the value of a painted jar. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how formal these exchanges were. Yet the archaeological traces are unmistakable enough to show that the Ubaid horizon was not isolated. Objects, materials, and styles moved. Pottery appears far from its likely centres of production. Obsidian from volcanic regions travels into communities that could never have obtained it locally. Shells and stones move along routes that connect the southern plain with uplands, coastlines, and neighbouring regions. These are not the records of a state-controlled economy. They are the footprints of contact. The movement of goods may have taken many forms. Some exchange probably happened through direct travel, with people carrying objects from one settlement to another. Some may have passed through chains of communities, each one moving an item a little farther from its source. Some goods may have travelled through marriage alliances, ritual visits, seasonal gatherings, or obligations between households. A person might not think of himself as a professional trader in the later sense, yet still carry pottery, stone blades, dried fish, woven goods, or bitumen along a familiar route. In a world without written contracts, trust is carried by kinship, reputation, memory, and repeated contact. Exchange is not only economic, it is social. Water helps make this possible. The rivers, marsh channels, and gulf routes create paths through a landscape that would otherwise be difficult to cross. A boat can move bulk goods more easily than a person on foot, especially through the watery south. Reeds, bitumen, and timber where available could be used in boat construction, though direct evidence for early craft is rare because organic materials decay. Still, the spread of Ubaid material along the Gulf strongly suggests that waterborne movement mattered. The Gulf is not a boundary at the edge of civilization. It is a long, shallow corridor, a route of contact, a space where coastal communities meet, exchange, adapt, and observe one another. Bitumen is one of the more revealing materials in this world. It occurs naturally in parts of Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, and it has practical uses that would have been immediately valuable: sealing, waterproofing, attaching, coating, and repairing. In a Martian river environment, waterproofing is not a luxury. It can protect baskets, boats, containers, and architectural elements. Traces of bitumen in early context remind us that technological skill does not always announce itself through metal tools or monumental engineering. Sometimes it appears as a dark, sticky substance applied exactly where water would otherwise enter. In the Ubaid world, survival and innovation often live in such practical details. Obsidian tells a different kind of story. It is volcanic glass, sharp, attractive, and useful for cutting. Since it does not occur in southern Mesopotamia, its presence reveals connections to distant regions, especially Anatolia and other volcanic zones, depending on the source. By analysing the chemical signature of obsidian artifacts, researchers can sometimes trace where the material came from. This creates a rare glimpse into prehistoric movement. A small blade or flake may represent a route stretching hundreds of kilometres, not necessarily travelled by one person from beginning to end, but connected through human hands. The object is small, but the world behind it is large. Pottery spreads in a more complicated way. Ubaid-style ceramics appear across wide areas, but their presence does not always mean the same thing. Some pots may have been transported as finished goods. Others may have been made locally in imitation of Ubaid styles. In some places, communities adopt Ubaid designs while continuing local practices. This is why scholars still debate whether the spread reflects migration, trade, cultural prestige, intermarriage, or local choice. No single explanation fully accounts for the whole pattern. The most likely answer is that different processes happened in different places. The Ubaid horizon is not a single wave washing evenly across the map. It is a web of contacts, uneven and changing. Trade also helps explain how ideas move before writing. A painted bowl does not carry a written message, but it can carry a style, a vessel used in a feast, a ritual, or a household display can make distant practices visible. A visitor sees a building plan, a way of arranging space, a method of firing pottery, a decorative pattern, or a ritual object, and carries the memory home. A craftsperson marries into another community and brings techniques. A family receives a foreign object and begins to copy it. A sacred center gains prestige, and its forms are imitated elsewhere. In this way, culture travels through use, admiration, and repetition rather than through commands. The southern need for imported resources may also have encouraged some communities to produce surplus. Grain, fish products, textiles, reeds, mats, pottery, and perhaps dairy or animal goods could become exchange items. The evidence for exact commodities is uneven, because many likely trade goods decay or leave only indirect traces. Textiles, for example, may have been important but are largely invisible. If wool or woven goods moved through Ubaid networks, archaeology would struggle to prove it except through tools, impressions, or later analogies. This creates a bias toward durable materials. Stone and pottery appear in the record, while the soft wealth of the ancient world fades. Exchange creates consequences beyond material comfort. It widens imagination. It teaches communities that their world is larger than the visible horizon. It brings unfamiliar stones, shells, colours, techniques, and perhaps stories. It also creates dependency. A settlement that values imported stone or bitumen must maintain relationships. A community that gains status through access to distant goods may begin to develop social differences. Those who control routes, boats, storage, or ritual distribution can become important. Again, this does not prove kingship, but it reveals another path by which hierarchy may slowly form. Authority can grow from knowing where things come from and how to get them. By the late Ubaid period, the networks of exchange have helped create a world ready for more formal administration. The later Uruk period will make these movements more visible through seals, accounting devices, and eventually writing. But the habit of connection is older. People have already learned to move goods, recognize styles, maintain relationships, and value materials from far away. The silence before writing is therefore not the silence of isolation. It is a busy silence, full of boats, paths, hands, gifts, obligations, and remembered routes. The Ubaid world trades without leaving ledgers, and because of that, much of its movement has to be inferred from fragments. Yet those fragments are enough to show that before Sumer's scribes pressed signs into clay, the older civilization had already learned one of history's most powerful lessons: no settlement, however fertile, becomes complex entirely alone. As Ubaid pottery, architecture, and ritual habits spread across Mesopotamia and into neighbouring regions, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. A single style appears over a vast area, but there is no clear empire behind it. No army marks the spread with burned settlements. No royal road binds the communities together. No central archive records orders sent from one capital to distant provinces. Instead, archaeologists find a quieter and more puzzling pattern: painted ceramics, building forms, symbolic objects, and settlement habits appearing across landscapes that are not identical and among communities that must have had their own local histories. The Ubaid world expands, but it expands in a way that resists the usual language of conquest. This is one of the strange features of the civilization older than Sumer. It seems to become influential before it becomes politically loud. The style associated with the Ubaid horizon reaches north into Mesopotamia, appears around the Gulf, and interacts with communities beyond the southern heartland. Yet its spread is not uniform. In some places, Ubaid-style pottery appears alongside local traditions. In others, architecture or artifacts suggest deeper adoption of southern habits. Some settlements seem closely tied to the Ubaid cultural world, while others only borrow certain forms. What survives in the record suggests a broad network of influence, but not a simple map of control. Scholars still debate what caused this spread. One explanation is migration. People from southern Mesopotamia may have moved into new areas, carrying their pottery, building styles, rituals, and ways of life with them. This may have happened in some cases, especially where Ubaid material appears strongly and consistently. Movement of people is always part of ancient history, even when it leaves faint traces. Families may relocate for access to land, water, marriage, trade, or safety. Small groups may settle near valuable resources or along exchange routes. Over generations, their habits can reshape local culture. But migration alone does not fully explain the pattern. Another possibility is imitation. Ubaid objects may have carried prestige. A community that receives imported pottery or sees Ubaid-style vessels used in rituals or feasts may begin to copy them. Local potters can reproduce foreign forms without the arrival of large numbers of outsiders. Styles often travel faster than people. A design painted on a bowl can become desirable because it suggests connection to distant centres. participation in a wider world, or access to valued relationships. In that sense, Ubaid pottery may have functioned almost like a shared cultural signal. It does not need writing to say something. Its shape and decoration already mark belonging. Trade offers a third explanation, and it likely overlaps with the others. The southern plain needs materials from beyond itself, while other regions may want southern goods, styles, or relationships. Exchange networks create regular contact, and regular contact creates familiarity. A pot travels, a person travels with it, a method is observed, a marriage connects households, a ritual object is copied, a building idea is adapted over time. Local communities become part of a larger Ubaid-looking world without surrendering all their older identities. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The Ubaid spread is probably not one event, but many small processes repeated over centuries. There is also the possibility of what might be called cultural diplomacy, though the term is modern and must be used carefully. Shared styles may help communities recognize one another across distance. In a world without written passports, seals of empire or standardized laws, pottery, ornament, ritual habits, and architecture can become signs of trust. A vessel made in a familiar style may signal that a household participates in known exchange networks. A temple-like building may embody a shared sacred vocabulary. A feast using recognizable objects may make strangers less strange. Culture becomes a bridge, and sometimes a boundary. The surprising thing is how far this shared style can travel without the evidence of a single political structure. Later empires often spread culture through administration, military power, taxation, and forced labor. The Ubaid horizon suggests a more diffuse kind of influence. It may have spread because it was useful, attractive, flexible, or tied to important exchange relationships. It may also have spread because communities on the edges of the Ubaid world actively chose what to adopt. Ancient people are not passive recipients of influence. They select, adapt, resist, and reinterpret. A northern community using Ubaid-style pottery may not be becoming southern in every sense. It may be taking one element and giving it a local meaning. This is why archaeologists must be cautious. A pottery style is powerful evidence, but it is not a people by itself. The older habit of equating pots with ethnic groups has been criticized because material culture can move in many ways. A pot can travel without its maker. A design can be copied by someone who has never seen the original community. A local group can adopt foreign objects for reasons that outsiders cannot easily reconstruct. The evidence remains incomplete. And the relationship between style, identity, language, ancestry, and power is rarely simple. The Ubaid horizon is therefore not a clear map of one people spreading over empty land. It is a record of interaction. Still, the spread has consequences. Shared material culture creates a larger stage for later developments. When communities across Mesopotamia become accustomed to common forms, exchange habits, and ritual patterns, the region becomes more integrated, not politically unified, but culturally connected. This makes later transformations easier to understand. The Uruk expansion that follows in the 4th millennium before the Common Era will be more urban, more administrative, and in some places more intrusive. But the ground has already been prepared by centuries of Ubaid contact. People are already used to long-distance relationships. They already recognize styles from afar. They already live in a world where ideas do not remain local. The spread of Ubaid culture also hints at an early form of soft power. There is no evidence that Ubaid leaders commanded distant regions, but the cultural package associated with the Ubaid carried influence. Its pottery, architecture, and sacred forms had appeal or importance beyond their birthplace. Perhaps southern communities possessed prestige because of their ritual centers, their access to Gulf routes, or their role in exchange networks. Perhaps their ways of organising settlement seemed effective in landscapes facing similar challenges. Perhaps the painted pottery itself became a symbol of participation in a world larger than the village. Whatever the reason, the Ubaid style moved, and as it moved, it made southern Mesopotamia harder to ignore. This creates a deep contradiction at the centre of the forgotten civilization. It is widespread enough to matter enormously, but silent enough to remain obscure. It shapes later history, yet it does not explain itself. Its influence reaches beyond one region, yet it leaves no king claiming credit. The very thing that makes it fascinating also makes it difficult. It is a civilization of patterns rather than proclamations. A bowl, a house plan, a sacred building, a figurine. A settlement mound each holds part of the story, but none gives the final answer. By the time the Ubaid horizon begins to give way to the next great transformation, Mesopotamia is no longer a collection of isolated communities. It is a connected world with shared symbols and remembered roots. The strange spread of one style has created a cultural landscape in which later cities can grow with astonishing speed. Sumer will one day appear to rise brilliantly from the plain, but its brightness depends on this older, dimmer network. Before writing fixes history into names. The Ubaid world spreads through clay, habit, imitation, and exchange. Its people leave no manifesto, but their style travels farther than their voices ever could. The deepest silence in the Ubaid world is not the absence of buildings, tools, pottery, or settlement. It is the absence of its own written voice. Later Mesopotamia is crowded with words. Clay tablets preserve accounts, offerings, ration lists, hymns, myths, legal records, royal names, and the everyday scratches of administration. Sumer speaks through signs pressed into wet clay and hardened by accident, fire, time, and burial. The Ubaid world does not. It stands at the edge of history's hearing, close enough to the age of writing that its influence can be felt, but far enough before it that its thoughts remain locked behind objects. This is why it can be both foundational and forgotten. Writing changes the way a civilization survives. A ruin can show where people lived, but a text can say what they counted, feared, praised, owed, inherited, and remembered. Without writing, archaeologists must reconstruct life through material patterns. A storage room may suggest surplus, but not who controlled it. A temple may suggest ritual, but not the name of the god. A burial may suggest care, rank, or belief, but not the story told over the body. Painted pottery may reveal shared style, but not the words people used for belonging. The evidence remains incomplete, not because nothing happened, but because the most direct bridge between mind and record had not yet appeared in durable form. This does not mean the Ubaid people lacked language, memory, or complex thought. They surely had spoken languages, traditions, songs, instructions, disputes, jokes, ritual formulas, and stories of origins, floods, ancestors, animals, and sacred places. None of those voices survive directly. Speech lives only while it is carried by bodies, unless some technology preserves it. In the Ubaid period, memory probably moves through repetition, elders teaching the young, potters demonstrating patterns, farmers remembering water levels, ritual specialists preserving ceremonies, households recounting kin histories, travellers describing distant settlements. Such memory can be strong, but it is vulnerable. When the chain of transmission breaks, whole worlds of meaning vanish. Archaeology therefore reads the Ubaid world almost like a language without translation. The signs are there, but their grammar is uncertain. A figurine appears in clay, carefully shaped, sometimes with strange proportions and markings. It clearly meant something, but the meaning has no surviving explanation. A temple is rebuilt on the same place, again and again. The continuity is obvious, but the belief behind it is not. A pottery style spreads across regions, but whether it signals migration, prestige, exchange, shared ritual, or local imitation remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern. The Ubaid record is rich in evidence and poor in direct testimony. This silence also affects how history assigns importance. Civilizations with writing often appear more advanced because they describe themselves, even when older societies had already developed complex practices. Sumer's fame is partly deserved because its written records are extraordinary. But writing also gives Sumer an advantage in memory. It can name itself. It can list rulers. It can preserve myths of gods, kings, cities, and cosmic order. The Ubaid world cannot defend its place in history with its own words. It must be recognized by later investigators, working backward through broken remains. This is one reason it long stood in Sumer's shadow. The civilization that writes becomes the beginning, while the civilization that prepared the ground becomes the background. Even so, the Ubaid world may have used systems of marking, counting, or symbolic communication that foreshadow later administration. Across the ancient Near East, tokens, sealings, and impressed objects eventually become part of the long development toward writing and accounting. For the Ubaid period specifically, the evidence must be handled cautiously, but the broader movement toward managing goods, storage, exchange, and identity is already underway. A society with temples, surplus, long-distance contact, and craft traditions needs ways to remember obligations. It may rely on human memory, visible containers, marks, seals, repeated customs, or trusted roles before true writing develops. The boundary between memory and record does not appear all at once. It thickens gradually. Seals are especially important in this slow transition, though their full administrative explosion belongs more clearly to later periods. A seal can mark ownership, identity, control, or authorization without using writing. It can close a container, secure a door, or signal that something has been approved. In a world where goods move and storage matters, such devices become powerful. They create trust at a distance. They allow someone to know whether a jar, bundle, or room has been opened. They do not speak in sentences, but they speak socially. They say that an object has passed through a recognized relationship. What survives in the record suggests that the habits leading toward administration existed before the fully literate bureaucracy of later Mesopotamia. The lack of texts also hides conflict. Later records tell of wars, rival cities, boundary disputes, and political ambition. In the Ubaid world, violence is harder to see. There are no battle inscriptions. There are no written complaints about stolen fields or broken canals. This has sometimes encouraged an image of a peaceful, communal Ubaid society. It may have been less militarized than later city-states, but certainty is impossible. Conflict can leave little trace if it is small-scale, seasonal, or settled without destruction. Disputes over water, land, animals, marriage, exchange, or ritual authority almost certainly occurred, because human communities do not become complex without friction. The evidence simply does not let those conflicts speak clearly. The same silence hides personal identity. Later Mesopotamian tablets preserve names of workers, officials, priests, debtors, and rulers. Ubaid individuals remain anonymous. A potter's skill can be seen, but not the potter's name. A builder's labour survives in the wall, but not in memory. A child buried with care is visible as a body, but not as a life story. This anonymity can make the Ubaid world seem distant, yet it also reveals something profound about early civilization. Much of human history was made by people who never expected to be recorded. Their importance lies not in fame, but in continuity. They carried traditions forward until later societies inherited them without remembering the carriers. The Ubaid world's voicelessness is therefore not emptiness. It is an invitation to read differently. Instead of listening for kings, one must listen to settlement patterns. Instead of searching for chronicles, one must follow pottery. Instead of expecting myths in written form, one must notice the repeated rebuilding of sacred places. Instead of asking only what people said about themselves, one must ask what their labour made possible. This kind of history is slower and less certain, but it can reveal foundations that written traditions overlook. By the time writing emerges in southern Mesopotamia, it does not appear from nowhere. It grows from a world already concerned with goods, labour, ritual, storage, and connection. The first written signs will serve administration before literature. They will count before they tell stories. That practical beginning fits the long Ubaid inheritance. Before words are written, communities have already created the problems writing will help solve. The silence before Sumer is full of preparation. Clay tablets will later give Mesopotamia a voice, but the older civilization has already shaped the mouth through which that voice will speak. As the Ubaid world changes, it does not end with a dramatic crash. There is no single burned horizon across southern Mesopotamia, no clear invasion layer that neatly separates one age from another, no final monument left in ruins as a warning. Instead, the older pattern begins to transform into something larger, denser, more demanding, and more visible to history. Settlements grow, labour becomes more organised, craft production expands, administrative habits sharpen, sacred centres become more imposing. The slow networks of the Ubaid period begin to give way to the more powerful urban current later called Uruk. This transition is one of the most important turning points in human history, but it's also one of the easiest to misunderstand because it looks less like replacement and more like acceleration. The Uruk period, beginning after the Ubaid and developing especially in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, brings many of the features people associate with the birth of civilization in Mesopotamia. Cities become larger and more complex. Monumental buildings rise on a scale beyond earlier village temples. Administrative tools multiply, cylinder seals, accounting devices, standardized containers, and eventually the earliest writing appear within a world increasingly concerned with managing goods and labour. Uruk itself becomes a vast centre, one of the earliest true cities. Yet this new urban world does not appear on untouched ground. It grows from older roots, and many of those roots reach directly into Ubaid soil. The turning toward Uruk begins with population and settlement. Ubaid communities had already learned how to live in the southern alluvial environment, how to farm, manage water, build in mud brick, maintain sacred places, and connect across distance. Over time, some settlements become larger and more influential than others. The landscape of many small communities begins to tilt towards central places. This process is not fully understood, and scholars still debate the roles of irrigation, trade, religious authority, population growth, environmental pressure, and social competition. No single explanation fully accounts for the emergence of cities, but what survives in the record suggests that by the late Ubaid and early Uruk phases, the older village-centered world is being pulled into larger systems. One of the clearest changes is scale. Ubaid temples are important because they show continuity and communal organization, but Uruk period monumental buildings are far more ambitious. Mud brick architecture becomes vast, formal, and institutionally powerful. Public buildings occupy large precincts. Decorative techniques, including cone mosaics and later Uruk contexts, create visual effects far beyond ordinary domestic space. The built environment begins to separate more strongly between common households and institutional centres. This does not mean everyone suddenly obeys a king. Early Uruk political organisation remains debated, but it does mean that some institutions now command more labour, more resources, and more attention than before. Administration becomes another turning point. In the Ubaid world, exchange and storage existed without writing. In the Uruk world, the need to count, seal, measure, and control becomes increasingly visible. Clay tokens, seal impressions, numerical tablets, and early pictographic signs point toward a society managing larger flows of grain, animals, textiles, labour, and offerings. The earliest writing is not born as poetry or philosophy. It begins as practical memory, a way to hold information outside the human mind. This is a surprising detail because the first written marks are often less dramatic than later myths. But they reveal something profound. Writing emerges because society has become too complex for memory alone. The shift is not only technical, it changes power. A person who controls records can control obligations. A sealed container, a counted ration, a measured field, or a recorded delivery creates a new kind of authority. It is no longer based only on reputation, ritual knowledge, or household memory. It can be stored in clay. This does not erase older forms of power, especially temple authority, but it adds a new layer. The world is moving toward bureaucracy, and bureaucracy makes inequality more durable. The Ubaid temple gathered the community. The Uruk institution begins to manage it. Craft production also expands. In earlier Ubaid communities, pottery and other crafts may have ranged from household production to partial specialization. In the Uruk period, standardization becomes much more visible, especially in objects like bevel rim bowls, which appear in enormous numbers and have been interpreted in different ways, often connected to ration distribution or mass production. Their exact function remains debated, but their abundance suggests a world of repeated institutional practice. Objects are no longer only household possessions or local expressions of style. Many become parts of systems. The hand still makes them, but the system determines their quantity and use. The relationship between temple and economy grows tighter. Later Mesopotamian cities will develop powerful temple institutions that own land, receive offerings, employ workers, and redistribute goods. The roots of this pattern likely lie in the long sacred traditions of the Ubaid and the expanding administrative needs of Uruk. A sacred centre that once anchored communal identity can become a hub for storage, labour, and production. This transformation may not have felt sudden to those living through it. A family might still bring goods to a familiar sacred place, still work fields, still use canals, still participate in festivals. Yet over generations, the scale of obligation changes. What was once local and personal becomes institutional. The rise of Uruk also changes the map beyond southern Mesopotamia. Uruk material culture spreads widely. In some regions through colonies, enclaves, trade stations, or strong influence. Compared with the Ubaid spread, the Uruk expansion appears more economically and administratively intense, though its nature varies by region. The older Ubaid network had already made long-distance connection normal. Uruk builds upon that inheritance with greater organization and ambition. Distant communities now encounter not only pottery styles, but more complex packages of administration, architecture, and economic practice. The world is becoming more interconnected, and also more unequal. Still, the Ubaid does not simply disappear beneath Uruk like a people erased. Many older habits continue in altered form. Mud brick building remains central. Sacred spaces remain central. Water management remains central. Long-distance exchange remains central. The importance of the southern plain remains central. Even the idea that a community's identity is tied to a powerful sacred centre has deep Ubaid roots. What changes is intensity. The quiet gathering becomes a city-making force. The flexible network becomes a more structured system. The remembered sacred mound becomes part of an institutional landscape. The unnamed labourer becomes counted labour. This transformation carries a human cost that is difficult to measure. Larger settlements can offer security, ritual grandeur, access to goods, and shared identity. They can also demand more labour, enforce hierarchy, and reduce personal autonomy. A person living in the early Uruk world may experience opportunities unknown to earlier villagers, but also obligations their ancestors never faced in the same way. The city is not simply progress made of brick. It is a bargain. It concentrates food. People, gods, use skills, use memory and power. It also concentrates dependency. The turning toward Uruk is therefore the moment when the forgotten civilization begins to vanish by succeeding. The Ubaid world prepares the conditions for something more visible, and that more visible world overshadows it. Once writing appears, history's attention shifts toward tablets, cities, and named institutions. The older centuries become prehistory, even though they created the patterns that made history possible. In the deep Mesopotamian sequence, the Ubaid is not a failed beginning. It is the long preparation before the first city fully recognizes its own power. Sumer will later inherit that city-making world, but the path has already been laid by nameless builders, farmers, potters, fishers, ritual leaders, and canal workers whose civilization turns into Uruk before it can ever explain itself. Once Sumer enters the written record, it becomes almost impossible for the older world beneath it to compete for memory. Sumer has names. It has cities whose identities become powerful enough to survive for thousands of years. It has Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish, and others, each connected to gods, rulers, conflicts, temples, and stories. It has scribes who press signs into clay and create a new kind of durability. It has myths that later cultures copy, reshape, and inherit. It has economic records that reveal the movement of grain, animals, workers, textiles, beer, oil, and offerings. It has kings who want to be remembered and institutions that require documentation. The Ubaid world, by contrast, leaves no sentence saying what it was. That difference alone helps explain why Sumer took the credit. This is not because Sumer is unimportant. It is one of the great turning points in world history. Its cities become some of the earliest fully urban, literate societies known. Its writing system, developing from earlier administrative marks into cuneiform, opens a new era of recorded human experience. Its temples, schools, officials, craft systems, and long-distance networks reshape Mesopotamia and influence later civilizations across the ancient Near East. To recognize the Ubaid foundation is not to diminish Sumer. It is to make Sumer more understandable. The famous beginning becomes less like a miracle and more like the visible crest of a much older wave. Memory favors civilizations that leave archives. A clay tablet can survive fire, burial, and ruin in ways that reed, wood, cloth, and spoken tradition cannot. Sumerian texts preserve not only practical records, but a sense of intellectual life hymns, myths, proverbs, school exercises, royal inscriptions, and later literary compositions. Even when those texts come from periods after the first emergence of Sumerian civilization, they pull the whole region into a written world. They make later people feel that Sumer is where history begins because, in one narrow but powerful sense, history as readable testimony does begin there. The problem is that readable testimony is not the same as human beginning. The Ubaid world exists before that documentary advantage. Its people may have had rich oral traditions, but oral memory does not survive when the chain breaks. They may have had names for communities, gods, lineages, waterways, and sacred places. But those names are gone unless later traditions preserve faint echoes. And even then the connection is difficult to prove. Archaeologists can identify Ubaid pottery, buildings, figurines, and settlement patterns. But those things do not announce themselves as a civilization in the same direct way a tablet does. The result is a distortion of visibility. Later Sumer stands under a lamp. The Ubaid stands just outside the circle of light. Later Mesopotamian tradition also plays a role. Sumerians and their successors remembered ancient cities through myth, theology, and royal ideology. Erid, for example, could be imagined as profoundly ancient, a sacred place associated with beginnings. Kingship itself, in later tradition, could be traced through legendary frameworks that gave order to the past. But such memory is not archaeology. It preserves meaning, not a neutral timeline. By the time scribes write about origins, the Ubaid world has already been transformed, absorbed, and renamed through later religious and political imagination. What survives in the record suggests continuity, but continuity filtered through memory can hide the people who made it possible. Sumer also took the credit because it looked more like what modern historians expected civilization to look like. Early scholars searching for the first civilization often valued writing, monumental architecture, cities, political institutions, and visible hierarchy. Sumer had all of these in recognizable forms. The Ubaid had precursors, foundations, and ambiguous signs. It had sacred buildings, but not the later temple economy in full written detail. It had social differences, but not royal tombs shouting inequality. It had exchange, but not merchant accounts. It had shared styles across distance, but no imperial proclamations. When civilization is defined by the loudest surviving evidence, the quieter foundations are easy to demote into background. There is also the simple power of names. Sumer feels like a civilization because it is a name known from ancient textual and linguistic contexts. It can be placed in maps, timelines, museums, and school books. Ubaid is a modern archaeological label, taken from a site and applied to a material culture. It sounds technical because it is technical. It does not carry the ancient self-awareness that Sumer appears to have. Nobody in the Ubaid period, as far as evidence shows, called themselves Ubaid. That name is a tool created by modern scholars to organize fragments. It is necessary, but it creates distance. A civilization with an ancient name feels alive in a way a pottery horizon does not. The transformation into Uruk and then Sumer further buries the older identity. If the Ubaid world had ended in fire, invasion, or total abandonment, it might have left a dramatic mystery. Instead, it seems to have changed into what followed. Its buildings were rebuilt, its settlements evolved, its sacred places continued, its habits of water management, mud brick construction, exchange, and ritual authority became part of the later Mesopotamian inheritance. This kind of disappearance is subtle. A destroyed civilization leaves ruins. An absorbed civilization leaves foundations. Foundations are essential, but they are rarely celebrated. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how direct the line is between Ubaid communities, Uruk urbanism, and later Sumerian identity. Language is one of the greatest uncertainties. The Ubaid people did not leave texts, so no one can say with confidence what language or languages they spoke. Some may have been ancestors of later Sumerian speakers, but that cannot simply be assumed. Southern Mesopotamia may have included multiple groups, changing populations, and layered identities over time. This uncertainty makes it even harder to connect the Ubaid world to the named Sumerians who later dominate the written record. The cultural continuity is visible in many ways, but ethnic and linguistic continuity remains more difficult. Yet the deeper lesson is clear. Sumer took the credit because history remembers the moment complexity becomes legible, not always the centuries that made it possible. Writing transforms societies into narrators of themselves. Kings transform power into names. Monuments transform labour into spectacle. The Ubaid world had not yet crossed fully into that mode of memory. It created the stage. but Sumer delivered the speech. So the older civilization slipped behind the curtain. It remained in the mound beneath the temple, in the settlement pattern beneath the city, in the water channel beneath the irrigation state, in the pottery tradition beneath later craft systems, in the sacred habit beneath Mesopotamian religion. It did not need to vanish completely to be forgotten. It only needed to become too deeply embedded in what came after. Sumer shines because it wrote. The Ubaid endures because it prepared the clay. The cities, the institutions, and the human habits that made writing worth inventing. The end of the Ubaid world is difficult to describe because it may not have ended in the way people expect civilizations to end. There is no single catastrophe that freezes the story into a dramatic final scene. No known enemy arrives and wipes the entire culture from the map. No obvious burned layer across all its settlements marks a universal collapse. No inscription from later conquerors boasts of destroying the people who came before Sumer. Instead, the Ubaid seems to blur at its edges, changing gradually into the Uruk world and then into the historical landscape of early Mesopotamian cities. It disappears less like a city swallowed by sand and more like a river losing its name after joining a larger current. This makes the Ubaid one of the more haunting kinds of lost civilization, not one that vanishes suddenly, but one that is absorbed so completely that later history forgets to separate it from what followed. Archaeologists can identify Ubaid phases through pottery, architecture, settlement patterns, and certain symbolic forms, but those markers shift over time. Styles change. Communities grow. Sacred centers are rebuilt. Administrative needs increase. New kinds of objects appear. The old world does not stop breathing one day. Its breath changes rhythm. What survives in the record suggests a transformation rather than a clean replacement. Although the details vary from region to region and remain debated, the word collapse may therefore be too sharp. Collapse suggests a structure falling down, a sudden loss of organization, a before and after divided by ruin. Some ancient societies really do show evidence of abrupt breakdown, caused by drought, war, migration, volcanic eruption, economic disruption, or internal strain. The Ubaid transition is subtler. There may have been local abandonments, regional disruptions, environmental pressures, and social tensions. But the larger cultural pattern appears to evolve into new forms. Many of the practices that define the Ubaid do not vanish. Mud brick architecture continues. Temple-centered sacred space continues. Farming and irrigation continue. Long-distance exchange continues. Settlement in the southern plain continues. The problem is that these practices become part of a new cultural package, and the older identity fades. Absorption can be harder to see than destruction. When a city burns, the ash remains. When a people are conquered, the conqueror may leave records. When a landscape dries, abandoned fields can speak. But when a society changes into another society, archaeology must track continuity and difference at the same time. The same mound may hold Ubaid levels below Uruk levels. The same sacred place may be rebuilt with new forms. The same region may contain descendants of earlier communities living under changed institutions. The people themselves may not feel that an age has ended. They may simply adopt new pottery styles, join larger settlements, participate in expanding temple economies, or find themselves drawn into new systems of labour and administration. Environmental change may still have played a role, though it cannot be used as a single simple explanation. Southern Mesopotamia is always vulnerable to shifts in river channels, flooding, marsh movement, salinization, and changing access to water. A settlement dependent on one channel may decline if that channel shifts. Fields may lose productivity if drainage worsens. Marsh zones may expand or contract. The coastline and river mouths may change over long periods. These processes could push communities to move, merge, or reorganize. Scholars still debate how much environmental pressure shaped the late Ubaid transition, and the evidence remains incomplete because the ancient landscape itself has been heavily altered. Still, it is difficult to imagine social change in this region without water somewhere in the background. Population growth may have added another pressure. As communities became more successful at farming, herding, fishing, and exchange, they could support more people. More people meant more labour, but also more mouths to feed, more disputes to manage, more water to allocate, and more need for storage and coordination. A small village can solve many problems through kinship and face-to-face negotiation. A larger settlement needs more formal habits. If sacred centres already provided places of gathering and authority, they may have expanded naturally into broader institutions. The transition toward Uruk may therefore reflect the consequences of Ubaid's success. The older system worked well enough to create conditions that eventually exceeded it. Competition may also have mattered, but it is difficult to measure. Later Mesopotamian city-states compete fiercely over land, water, gods, trade, and prestige. In the Ubaid period, evidence for organized warfare is much less visible, but absence of dramatic war records does not prove a world without conflict. Disputes over canals, fields, animals, marriage alliances, trade access, or ritual authority could have pushed communities toward a stronger leadership. As some settlements grew larger and more influential, smaller ones may have become dependent, subordinate, or abandoned. No single explanation fully accounts for the regional changes, but social competition likely formed one part of the slow movement toward hierarchy. Another possibility is that the Ubaid world's shared cultural style gradually lost its organizing power. For centuries, Ubaid pottery and customs helped create a recognizable horizon across diverse communities. But as local centers grew and new institutions formed, older markers of shared identity may have been replaced by more powerful urban and administrative systems. Pottery styles changed not merely because artists preferred new designs, but because social life itself changed. Mass production, institutional distribution, and administrative control encouraged different objects. The elegant painted ceramics of the Ubaid gave way in many contexts to plainer, standardized forms associated with the later Uruk world. A change in pottery can seem small, but it may signal a major change in how labor, food, and identity are organized. The fate of the Ubaid people themselves remains uncertain because material culture does not equal ethnicity. Some communities may have been ancestors of later urban populations. Others may have merged with incoming groups. Some may have shifted language, identity, or social status over time. Since the Ubaid left no texts, its linguistic world is unknown. It is possible that multiple languages were spoken across the broad Ubaid horizon. It is possible that some groups who helped build the Ubaid foundations later became part of Sumerian-speaking populations, but that cannot be proven directly. The human story is therefore more complex than a simple statement that one people disappeared and another arrived. The records suggest mixture, continuity, and transformation. This kind of ending is deeply human. Many cultures do not die in a single moment. They change through marriage, migration, imitation, pressure, ambition, and adaptation. Children grow up using different objects than their grandparents. Sacred buildings are rebuilt in new styles. Old rituals are given new names. Villages become neighborhoods of larger towns. Local leaders become officials within wider institutions. A remembered way of life becomes ordinary background. Eventually. No one living inside the new world thinks of the old one as separate. It has become ancestry. So the Ubaid did not collapse in the grand theatrical sense. It was absorbed, transformed, and overwritten by the very civilization it helped create. Its disappearance is the disappearance of foundations beneath walls, of roots beneath a tree, of older channels beneath a city's canals. Later, Sumer did not stand apart from it like a conqueror standing over ruins. Sumer rose through it, borrowing its landscape, sacred habits, building traditions, exchange networks, and accumulated knowledge. The Ubaid world was not lost because it failed. It was lost because it succeeded so thoroughly that its name was never needed by the people who inherited it. Beneath the first cities of Sumer, the Ubaid world remains like an older current moving under the surface. It is not always visible in a dramatic way, because legacy rarely survives as a perfect copy. It survives through habits, places, assumptions, and institutions that later people treat as natural. By the time Sumerian cities rise into the written record, many of the things that make them possible already have deep roots: mud brick architecture, temple-centered identity, irrigation, settlement mounds, long-distance exchange, craft traditions, and the idea that a community can be organized around sacred and economic obligations. The names change, the scale changes, the record becomes louder, but the ground beneath the city is older than the city's own memory. Eridu shows this continuity with unusual force. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembered it as one of the most ancient and sacred places, and the archaeology beneath the site reveals Ubaid beginnings far below the later fame. The sacred mound did not become important only when written culture arrived. It had already been shaped by generations who rebuilt sacred architecture in the same place before Sumerian history could write its own explanation. This does not mean later myths preserve exact Ubaid beliefs, and scholars still debate how much continuity can be traced from Ubaid ritual to Sumerian religion. Yet the persistence of sacred location is difficult to dismiss. The place itself becomes a bridge between forgotten practice and remembered tradition. The temple is the strongest echo. In Sumer, temples become central to urban life, tied to gods, land, labor, storage, offerings, and political legitimacy. They are not simply places of worship in a narrow modern sense. They are institutions, economic centers, and symbols of civic identity. The Ubaid world does not show this full temple economy in written detail, but it shows the earlier habit of setting apart special buildings and rebuilding them with communal effort. That habit matters. Before a temple can become an institution managing fields and workers, it must first become a place people recognize as enduring. The Ubaid sacred center provides that older grammar of permanence. Irrigation is another echo hidden in plain sight. Later Mesopotamian cities depend on canals so completely that water management becomes inseparable from politics, agriculture, and survival. Sumerian rulers will later boast of canal works. Boundary disputes will involve fields and water, and cities will live or decline with shifting channels. But the knowledge required to farm the southern plain did not begin with royal inscriptions. Ubaid communities had already learned to coordinate water in a difficult environment. Their irrigation systems may have been smaller and more local, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the social habits behind them were foundational. To dig, clear, share, and repair channels is to build cooperation into the landscape. Mud brick architecture also carries memory. Later Sumerian cities rise in brick because the alluvial plain offers mud more readily than stone. Walls, houses, temples, platforms, and eventually massive sacred structures all belong to a building tradition shaped by the environment. The Ubaid people had already mastered the cycle of making, drying, repairing, and rebuilding mud brick structures. In such a world, buildings are not permanent objects once completed. They require care across generations. This creates the famous Mesopotamian mound, the tell, where settlement rises upward on the remains of earlier settlement. The physical form of the city is therefore a record of continuity. Each generation literally stands on the labor of the last. The Ubaid legacy also survives in settlement patterns. The later urban world does not emerge from scattered households suddenly deciding to become cities. It grows from a long history of villages, central places, sacred sites, fields, waterways, and exchange routes. Some settlements become more important than others. Some draw labour, goods, ritual attention, and population. This uneven landscape, already developing in the Ubaid period, sets the stage for later urban hierarchy. The city is not simply a larger village. It is a centre that depends on surrounding communities, fields, canals, herds, crafts, and institutions. Ubaid society helped create the first outlines of that relationship between centre and hinterland. Long-distance exchange provides another surviving thread. Sumerian cities will later reach for timber, stone, metals, shells, and luxury goods from far beyond southern Mesopotamia. Their myths and records remember distant lands, boats, mountains, and trade routes. But southern Mesopotamia's dependence on outside resources is older than Sumer. The Ubaid world had already turned scarcity into connection, because the plain lacked many raw materials. Communities learned to move goods through networks that stretched across rivers, marshes, uplands, and the Gulf. Later trade grows more organised and better documented, but its logic is ancient. The fertile south can produce food and textiles, but it must look outward for many materials that display status, build institutions, and expand technology. Even social hierarchy may preserve a Ubaid prehistory. Later Sumerian society includes officials, priests, craftspeople, labourers, dependents, and elites whose roles are documented in writing. In the Ubaid period, hierarchy is harder to see and probably less formalised, but differences in buildings, settlement size, ritual access, and goods suggest that social layers are beginning to form. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of inequality, but several Ubaid developments point in that direction: communal labour, control of sacred space, management of surplus, exchange networks, and water coordination. These are not yet the full machinery of the state, but they are parts from which the machinery can be assembled. The Ubaid echo is also present in what later Mesopotamia considers sacred geography. Cities in Sumer are not merely population centres. They are homes of gods, each with temples, rituals, and identities that bind human communities to divine order. This way of imagining place may have roots in the older habit of sacred settlement. A mound is not just high ground, it is memory. A temple is not just a building. It is the visible heart of a community's relationship with forces beyond human control. The Ubaid world cannot tell us the names of its gods, if gods in the later sense were already imagined there, but it leaves evidence that certain places mattered beyond ordinary use. What makes this legacy so powerful is that it hides inside success. The Ubaid does not survive as a separate kingdom remembered in later chronicles. It survives as infrastructure, custom, and inherited possibility. Sumerian scribes may not have thought of themselves as heirs to an archaeological culture named Ubaid, because that name did not exist. They may have remembered ancient places through myth, not through a modern sequence of periods. Yet their cities were built on choices made long before them to settle the difficult south, to trust mud brick, to gather around temples, to manage water, to exchange across distance, to turn surplus into social power, and to make place endure through rebuilding. The forgotten civilization older than Sumer therefore remains present wherever Sumer seems most original. Behind the temple stands the earlier sacred building. Behind the canal state stands the local irrigation community. Behind written administration stands the older need to remember goods and obligations. Behind urban trade stands the first networks of exchange. Behind the city mound stands the village rebuilt for centuries. The Ubaid world is not a lost chapter separate from Mesopotamian history. It is the underlayer that makes the famous chapters possible. Its people may have lost their names, but their decisions remained embedded in the landscape, waiting beneath the first cities like foundations beneath a wall. The forgotten beginning returns because archaeology keeps disturbing the neat stories people once told about civilization. For a long time, the ancient past was often arranged around firsts that felt clear and satisfying: first cities, first writing, first kings, first laws, first empires. Sumer stood at the front of that story with impressive force, and in many ways it still deserves its place there. But the deeper the spade cuts into the mounds of Mesopotamia, and the more carefully scholars read pottery, soil, settlement patterns, animal bones, plant remains, and traces of ancient water, the less sudden the beginning appears. Sumer no longer looks like a civilization that rose from emptiness. It looks like the visible crest of a long, slow, older transformation. The Ubaid world forces that correction. It reminds modern history that the most important beginnings are not always the loudest ones. A civilization can shape the future without writing its own name. It can create sacred centers, shared styles, exchange networks, irrigation habits, craft traditions, and patterns of settlement, then disappear into the societies that inherit them. This is why the Ubaid is so difficult and so important. It does not offer a simple founding myth. It offers a foundation. It asks scholars to treat mud brick pottery fragments and faint settlement layers with the same seriousness once reserved for royal inscriptions. Modern archaeology has made this older world clearer, but not complete. Excavations at sites such as Eridu, Tel el-Weli, Tel al-Ubaid, and other settlements across Mesopotamia have revealed pieces of the pattern, while surveys have shown how settlement systems changed over time. Ceramic studies trace styles and phases. Environmental research attempts to reconstruct ancient rivers, marshes, shorelines, and fields. Scientific analyses of materials such as obsidian can reveal long-distance contacts. Plant and animal remains help rebuild diets and economies. Each method adds another layer of evidence, but the picture still contains gaps. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because southern Mesopotamia's landscape has shifted so dramatically, and because many early sites may lie buried under later alluvium or damaged by time, development, and conflict. This incompleteness is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth. The Ubaid world survives unevenly, and any honest account must leave room for uncertainty. Scholars still debate how centralized Ubaid society was, how strongly temples shaped authority, whether some regions adopted Ubaid styles through migration or imitation, how early irrigation systems were organized, what languages people spoke, and how directly Ubaid communities connect to later Sumerians. These questions do not erase what is known. They give the known world its proper edges. Ancient history becomes more powerful when it does not pretend that every shadow has been filled. What is known is still extraordinary. By the 5th millennium before the Common Era, communities in southern Mesopotamia and beyond are participating in a cultural world with recognizable shared features. They build in mud brick, farm difficult land, use marsh resources, exchange across long distances, create painted pottery, maintain sacred buildings, and form settlements that are no longer simple temporary camps or isolated farms. Their society may not yet have the full machinery of the state, but it already contains many pressures that later make states possible. Their world stands between village life and urban civilization, and that middle position may be the most revealing place of all. The Ubaid also changes the emotional shape of the ancient past. It makes the rise of civilization feel less like triumph and more like accumulation. Each generation adds something small: a repaired channel, a rebuilt wall, a more formal ritual space, a remembered exchange route, a better fired pot, a more dependable field, a stronger obligation between households. None of these acts alone creates Sumer. Together, over centuries, they make Sumer imaginable. The first city is not only a place of invention, it is a place where countless older solutions finally concentrate. This is why the phrase older than Sumer should not be heard as a challenge meant to dethrone Sumer, but as a reminder that history has depth beneath its famous names. Sumer is the written blaze, the Ubaid is the long dawn before it. One gives us tablets and myths, the other gives us the conditions in which tablets and myths can appear. One preserves speech, the other preserves labour. One enters memory through words, the other waits in earth, clay, and broken vessels. There are still mysteries that may never be solved. The Ubaid people's own name for themselves is gone. They're gods, if they named them in ways later generations would recognise, are uncertain. Their songs, disputes, ceremonies, and private griefs have vanished. The meaning of many figurines remains debated. The exact motives behind the spread of their style remain open. The transition from their world into Uruk and Sumer is still being refined as new evidence is found and old evidence is reinterpreted. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire story, because the story unfolded across many communities over many centuries. It was not one event. It was a civilization forming before history had learned how to remember such things. And yet, from the fragments, a presence returns. It returns in the temple sequence at Eridu, where sacred ground is rebuilt until memory becomes architecture. It returns in the painted pottery carried or copied across wide distances. It returns in the marshland logic of reeds, boats, fish, and water. It returns in the recognition that early complexity could grow without kings, without writing, and without empire. It returns whenever the origins of civilization are moved backward from the moment of record to the slower work of preparation. The civilization older than Sumer that history forgot was never truly absent. It was beneath the first cities all along. It was in the mud brick before the monument, the offering before the archive, the canal before the state, the household before the palace, the shared style before the written name. Archaeology has not given it a voice in the way writing gives Sumer a voice, but it has given it shape. That shape is quiet, incomplete, and deeply human. It shows that civilization began not with a single proclamation, but with generations of people learning how to stay, gather, build, remember, exchange, and endure in a landscape that demanded everything from them. Their names disappeared, but the world they made did not. In the end, the oldest beginnings are rarely the ones that speak the loudest. They do not always stand in stone above the horizon or survive in lines of writing that can be read thousands of years later. Sometimes they remain underfoot, pressed into the earth beneath later cities, hidden in broken pottery, softened walls, vanished reeds, and river channels that no longer carry water. The Ubaid world belongs to that quieter kind of beginning. It does not give history a founder to remember. It gives history a foundation to uncover. Across the southern Mesopotamian plain, the people of that older world learned to live with uncertainty. They worked in mud and water, in heat and marshlight, in a landscape that could feed them generously and punish them without warning. They built houses that needed repair, temples that needed rebuilding, fields that needed channels, and communities that needed trust. They made things from materials that time does not easily preserve. Reeds decayed, textiles vanished, spoken stories faded. Names dissolved, yet enough remained to show that their world was not empty, simple, or waiting passively for civilization to arrive. It was already becoming one. Sumer would later write, Sumer would name, Sumer would build cities whose memory reached across millennia. But beneath that written brilliance lay centuries of unnamed preparation. The older people had already gathered around sacred places. They had already shaped mud brick into memory. They had already learned that water could be managed only through cooperation, that distant materials could bind distant communities, and that a settlement could become more than a cluster of homes. They had already crossed part of the long threshold from village to city, even if they left no words to tell us how it felt. Perhaps that is the lingering power of the Ubaid. It reminds us that civilizations are not only made by kings, scribes, and monuments. They are made by those who dig, carry, plant, repair, shape, fire, weave, steer, grind, bury, remember, and begin again. Their labour may disappear into the achievements of those who come later, but it does not vanish from the world. It remains in the pattern. And so the story closes not with a ruined palace or a final battle, but with a mound in the plain, quiet under the sun. Beneath it are walls built over older walls, floors laid over older floors, and the faint trace of people who never knew they would become the forgotten foundation of history. The wind moves across the ancient ground. The rivers have shifted, the marshes have changed, the cities that rose afterward have also fallen silent, but somewhere below the dust, the first long dawn of civilization is still there, waiting in clay.